So every year it happens at some point, to me anyway, and I'm sure it happens to other people too, especially other UU ministers and liberal traditions. Maybe it happens to you, I don't know. But someone asks me why I celebrate Easter, even though I'm not a Christian. Even my cat now is asking me why I'm celebrating Easter. Maybe you heard that. Why I'm celebrating Easter, I'm not feeding her. That's what she's saying. So, but people ask me why I celebrate Easter, even though I'm not a Christian or a believer in the physical resurrection of Jesus. And for many years, I always stumbled through some half-assed explanation because I was put on the spot. But a few years ago, I was thinking about it. I'm not a Christian, but every year, like other ministers in our denomination and in other liberal traditions, I deliver an Easter sermon. And in those sermons, we try to often, some ministers do anyway, try to skirt the issue of the idea of resurrection because, well, you know, it's just not reasonable. And our tradition places great emphasis on the use of reason in our spiritual search, right? Dead bodies coming back to life after 3 days in a grave just doesn't make sense. It's impossible. So we often give lovely sermons about the return of spring and flowers and grass, or about the lessons we can learn from nature and how we're sustained by Mother Nature. Or the subject is avoided altogether, right? And a sermon is delivered maybe about social justice or a UU historical subject is spoken about. And there's nothing wrong with either of those. I've sat through many sermons though, where, you know, especially on Easter, you know, they're talking about the life of the honeybee, you know, that which to me wasn't very inspiring. But I've always believed that if we're going to celebrate Easter or any religious or spiritual holiday for that matter, we should enter into the mythos of it. I've said this many times, to suspend our disbelief and our academic objectivity just for a while, and to try to get at the inner meaning of the holiday for ourselves. So I began thinking about Easter, as I said, a few years back, and I sat down to articulate what I think about it today. And I think I shared this in a sermon when I first wrote it a number of years ago, and I shared it on social media. In fact, you can find it if you're so inclined on the UUA worship web page. It's been put on there. I celebrate Easter because I believe it to be a spiritual metaphor, one of the most powerful and heartening of spiritual metaphors for our own apotheosis and resurrection to a new life. Every day offers us yet again the chance to experience our own divinity and spiritual transformation. The stone is rolled away and the tomb is left empty every time we acknowledge our own Christ reality, or Buddha nature, whatever name you want to call it, and the Christ reality of all beings and things as part and parcel of the ultimate divine mystery in which we live and move and have our being. And to do that, we have to die to our small, petty ego selves, which is a difficult, often painful process. And that, I believe, is the inner meaning and the spiritual work of Good Friday. It's a good day to reflect and to consider our own need to die to self, not in sorrow, but in anticipation of what is going to come. So that's become my standard answer to most people when they ask me why I celebrate Easter. It satisfies some people, and some people even agree with it. Others, not so much. Some people insist on a belief in the physical resurrection of Jesus, and not to believe it means that I am an apostate, a heretic, and I am doomed forever. Oh well. But the compelling and underlying message of Easter isn't whether it's true or not. It's the persistent call in our own lives to be fully alive, to be fully human. Because when we actually consider the Easter story and the story of the days leading up to it, we see that whether they come from the canonical Gospels or the Gnostic text or wherever, what comes through them, in them, is the humanity, not only of Jesus, but the people around him. When we consider the story of Good Friday, for example, we see that it's not just about crucifixion. It's about betrayal. It's about darkness. It's about sacrificing the lower for the higher. It's about state oppression and persecution. It's about speaking truth to power, about broken bonds and broken chains. It's about broken hearts. It's about the love of a mother for her son, a teacher for his students. If you know the story of the two criminals who were crucified alongside of Jesus, it's about one of those criminals turning a corner. It's about a friend that turns away. It's about denial, and it's about acceptance. It's about loyalty and about horror, ignorance and knowledge. It's about the life of the world. When we consider that story and we really try to enter into it, we usually gravitate towards seeing it through the lens of Jesus' experience, right? The central person in that story. That's because it's such a big lens to look through, right? And because of that, we tend to ignore or forget to consider the perspective and the roles that other people played in that story and what we might learn from them. You might be Jesus yourself in your own mind in that spiritual story, and that's good. You can enter into that experience and learn from it. But to someone else, you might be Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times and who didn't believe Mary when she came back and said that Jesus was alive. You might be Thomas, the famous doubting Thomas. You could be Judas or Pilate. Maybe you're Mary, the mother of Jesus, thinking about the loss that you've maybe endured. Or Simon, of Cyrene, who was forced to take the cross and carry it for Jesus when he could no longer do that. Maybe you're that centurion who, allegedly when Jesus died and it went dark and thunder and lightning happened, the centurion said, this man was the Son of God. We all have roles that we'd like to play, right? That we'd like to be. And we all, to some degree or another, end up playing out very different roles, though, for other people. The story of his denial of Jesus is as much a part of the story as the rest of the story. And so is the story of Judas, or at least the story about Judas that's been handed down to us in the canonical Gospels. Or the story of Pilate, who in some traditions, along with his wife, later on became a Christian. But the compelling and the underlying message of Easter isn't whether it's true or not. It's the persistent call in our own lives to be fully alive and fully human and fully divine, and the call to respond yes. Now, those canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all give slightly differing accounts about what happened on that first Easter morning. Some say that the women were frightened and ran away and didn't say anything about what they'd seen. Others say that they ran back and told the men, who, of course, didn't believe them. John says that Mary Magdalene, as we read earlier, stayed weeping. And then Jesus appeared to her, the first person that he appeared to, according to John. Remember what we said about Mary Magdalene a few weeks ago? Very important person, possibly they call her the apostle to the apostles. And it's interesting that you will hear people say things like, everybody deserted Jesus with me. And that's not true. Because the Christian scripture, the accounts in the gospel say that the women stayed at the cross. The women stayed. But many of us tend to be like the women in the story that's given when they ran away, right? You know, it's interesting. Every year we celebrate Easter in springtime as a time of rebirth and renewal. We talk and we sing about the flowers and the trees all coming back to life, about the grass returning. But despite all that talk of rebirth and renewal, we still run from it. The death side of things we don't want to hear about anymore. We have to be taught and reminded to look for the good, for the divine in things, instead of running. I know I need constant reminding for that. And I think that the idea, or the reason rather, we run from this idea of resurrection is because it requires change. It requires transformation. That, according to the story, is what happened to Jesus. Later on, we read stories, not in John, but in the other Gospels, that he was transformed. We spoke a few weeks ago about the transfiguration on Transfiguration Sunday. He was changed into something different, a new kind of person. And this is why those two disciples, if you know the story on the road to Emmaus, these two disciples are walking to Emmaus and talking about the crucifixion and how bad things were. And Jesus appears alongside of them on the road and walks with them and talks to them. They don't recognize him. He was a new person. At least this is the story. This is the mythos behind it. And they don't recognize him until they invite him in. Instead of going on because the day was ending, they invite him to come in and eat with them. And so he breaks bread. And as he breaks bread, through some miraculous way, they recognize who he is. But that transformation comes at a cost. Joseph Campbell puts it this way. He says this, he says, what has always been basic to Easter or resurrection is crucifixion. If you want resurrection, you must have crucifixion. Too many interpretations of the crucifixion have failed to emphasize that relationship and emphasize instead the calamity of the event. If you emphasize the calamity, you look for someone to blame, which is why over the centuries people have blamed the Jews wrongly. But crucifixion is not a calamity if it leads to new life. We must take a fresh look at this event if its symbolism is to be sensed. In the Christian tradition, Christ's crucifixion is a major problem. Why could not the Savior have just come? Why did he have to be crucified? Well, various theological explanations have come down to us, but this is Joseph Campbell speaking, but I think an adequate and proper one can be found in Paul's epistle to the Philippians, where he writes in chapter 2 that Christ did not think that godhood was something to be held onto, which is to say, neither should you, but rather he took the form of a servant, even to the death of on the cross. This is the joyful affirmation of the sufferings of the world. The imitation of Christ, then, is participating in the suffering and joys of the world, all the while seeing through them the radiance of the divine presence. I think that when we enter into that kind of willingness, that kind of state of willingness to live beyond our own selves, when we're willing to step out and say yes to the challenges of living in and working to change a world that's scarred by anger and hatred and shame and fear, when that willingness becomes the compelling reason for how we are in the world, then we enter into a state of redemption from ourself with a small s, and to a greater self with a capital S, of which we're all part, a state of grace, if you will. And so we experience our own pain, our own trials, our own death to the self in order not to redeem ourselves. After all, the Apostle Paul said, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, and the Buddha taught, be lamps unto yourselves, but also to bring redemption to the world. And then when we experience that, we understand the real meaning of the empty tomb, the tomb that's left empty and ready for any possibility through our own resurrection to a new life, a new understanding of what it really means to live fully a life of service and love and sacrifice. I'm not concerned with whether the resurrection of Jesus actually happened. I personally don't believe it did, but I've reached the point where to argue about it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't serve any purpose at all, at least not any purpose that will help me to live a good and useful life here and now. I know that for some people, the resurrection is proof that they too will somehow, someday be resurrected in the future to live in heavenly bliss forever. But resurrection, the idea of it, is more compelling, I think, if it has to do with the here and now. How do we live the spiritual reality of resurrection in our own lives on a daily basis? How does this fantastic impossibility become possible in a spiritual way and manifest in our lives and in the world? The Reverend Mark Harris writes this. He says, we can celebrate Easter by asking when resurrection is a reality for all of us. If we believe in a creative power which shatters the icy tomb of winter with the life-giving miracle of spring, we have seen a resurrection. If we believe in a creative power which moves tens and then tens of thousands of people to cry out against the injustices of society, enabling the downfall of hatred and prejudice, then we have fomented a resurrection. If we believe in a creative power lying within each human breast, which enables us to break the bonds of personal pain and know the hope of new tomorrows, then we have experienced a resurrection. May it be so. Happy Easter.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.